October 14, 1939, Scapa Flow, Orkney Islands, Scotland. Captain William Benn stands on the bridge of HMS Royal Oak, watching the dark waters of what the Admiralty calls the most secured naval anchorage in the world. Around him, the natural harbor stretches across 120 square miles, protected by a ring of islands whose narrow channels have been blocked with sunken ships, steel nets, and the confidence of 2 decades of peace. His battleship, 29,150 tons, 9 15-inch guns, 1,234 crew, rests at anchor in the supposedly impregnable home fleet base, surrounded by the cliffs and islands that have guarded British warships since 1914. We're safer here than in Portsmouth. The eastern channels are sealed. No submarine could possibly navigate Kirk Sound at night. The block ships make it impossible. At 0058, U-47 fires its first salvo of 3 torpedoes from 4,000 meters. One strikes Royal Oak's bow at 0104, severing the starboard anchor chain. The impact shakes the massive battleship, but damage appears minimal, perhaps a bulkhead breach, contained by watertight doors. Many crew members, roused from their hammocks, are told it's likely an internal explosion, maybe a spontaneous detonation in the inflammable store. Officers make quick inspections. Finding no catastrophic damage, they order men back to their berths. The ship settled slightly by the bow but remains stable. Prien repositions closer and at 0116, after reloading his bow tubes, fires a second salvo of 3 torpedoes from 2,000 meters. All 3 strike Royal Oak's starboard side in rapid succession, penetrating beneath the armor belt where the ship's hull is thinnest. The electricity fails instantly, plunging the ship into absolute darkness as she begins her death roll. Watertight doors that should contain the flooding are jammed or left open during the confusion. Water cascades through the ship at terrible speed. Men trapped below decks scramble upward through black corridors filling with seawater, fighting against the increasing list. On deck, sailors slide across tilting metal as the ship rolls past 45 degrees. 13 minutes after the fatal salvo, at 0129, HMS Royal Oak capsizes completely and sinks in 30 meters of water. 835 men die, including Rear Admiral Henry Blagrove, commanding the 2nd Battle Squadron, and 134 boy sailors under the age of 18. Only 396 survive, pulled from the freezing October water by rescue boats, including the drifter HMS Daisy II. The impossible has happened. How could a U-boat breach the most secure naval base in the world? If you're invested in these untold stories of audacity and unexpected turns in history, click the like button to support the channel and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Here's how it happened. A German U-boat, later identified as U-47, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Günther Prien, has penetrated Scapa Flow by threading through Kirk Sound at high tide, slipping between block ships that were supposed to make the passage impossible. The submarine fired 7 torpedoes total across 2 salvos, then escaped the same way it entered, navigating back through Kirk Sound while Royal Oak's survivors fought for their lives. The shock to British morale is immediate and devastating. If the home fleet's primary base, fortified since World War I with every defensive measure the Royal Navy could devise, could be breached so casually, what did safe harbor even mean? Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, visits Scapa Flow within weeks and orders the eastern approaches closed permanently. The solution wouldn't be sophisticated detection equipment or faster patrol boats, it would be something far more fundamental. The journey to creating impenetrable harbor defenses had begun 25 years earlier, during World War I, when submarines first emerged as existential threats to surface navies. In that earlier conflict, Germany's U-boats had nearly strangled Britain through commerce raiding, sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. Naval bases became obvious targets, concentrations of high-value warships, support vessels, and infrastructure, all confined in predictable locations. The Royal Navy's Grand Fleet, based at Scapa Flow from 1914 to 1919, faced constant submarine threat. The anchorage's geography provided natural protection, a vast, sheltered harbor surrounded by the Orkney Islands' rocky shores, with access through several narrow channels between islands. But natural protection wasn't enough against submarines that could slip beneath surface barriers. The Navy's solution combined multiple defensive layers: block ships deliberately sunk to obstruct channels, anti-submarine nets stretched across remaining gaps, patrol boats constantly circling, and shore batteries covering approaches with artillery. The defenses proved their worth. On November 23, 1914, the German submarine U-18 attempted to penetrate Scapa Flow through Hoxa Sound. The boat was spotted by lookouts, rammed by the patrol trawler Dorothy Gray, and forced to surface. The submarine's commander, Captain Lieutenant Heinrich von Hennig, scuttled U-18 to prevent capture. All crew survived and were taken prisoner. 4 years later, on October 28, 1918, just 2 weeks before the armistice, UB-116 made a second attempt. The submarine struck a newly laid mine in the eastern approaches, exploding with total loss of life, 36 crew killed. These defensive successes created dangerous complacency. After World War I ended, the Grand Fleet dispersed. Scapa Flow became a quiet backwater. The block ships, already aging hulls when deliberately sunk in 1914 to 1918, deteriorated rapidly in the fierce tidal currents that ripped through Orkney's channels at speeds up to 12 knots. Steel nets corroded in salt water. Support buoys rusted and collapsed. Concrete anchors shifted on the seabed. By 1930, the defenses existed more on admiralty charts than in physical reality. When World War II began, in September 1939, Scapa Flow returned to frontline duty as the home fleet's primary base. Hasty surveys revealed catastrophic decay. At Kirk Sound, the narrow channel between mainland Orkney and the island of Lamb Holm, 3 block ships, Thames, Soriano, and Numidian, had been sunk in 1914 to close the passage. 25 years later, 2 had collapsed into skeletal hulls barely breaking the surface. The third had shifted in storms, opening a gap approximately 50 feet wide. At high tide, this gap deepened to 17 feet, enough clearance for a Type 7B submarine with an 11-foot draft. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of Germany's submarine force, studied aerial reconnaissance photographs taken by Luftwaffe Captain Siegfried Knemeyer in September 1939. The intelligence was precise. Kirk Sound was vulnerable. At high tide, during the moonless phase, with calm seas and skilled navigation, a submarine could pass through on the surface, using darkness and the aurora borealis for illumination, slip into Scapa Flow's vast anchorage, attack the home fleet, and escape before patrol boats could respond. Donitz handpicked Captain Lieutenant Günther Prien for the mission. The 31-year-old commander had served in the Merchant Marine for 8 years before joining the Reichsmarine in 1933. He'd commanded U-boats for less than a year, but had already demonstrated exceptional skill and aggressive tactics. His submarine, U-47, was a Type 7B, 211 feet long, 624 tons surface displacement, maximum surface speed 17.7 knots, armed with 5 torpedo tubes, 4 bow, 1 stern, and 14 torpedoes total. U-47 departed Kiel on October 8, 1939, transited north around Scotland, and arrived off Orkney on October 13. Prien studied Kirk Sound through his periscope, confirming the aerial reconnaissance. That evening, as darkness fell and the aurora borealis illuminated the northern sky with shifting green curtains, U-47 surfaced and began its approach. At 0027 on October 14th, the submarine entered Kirk Sound, navigating on the surface between Soriano and Numidian. The U-boat briefly grounded on a submerged cable, probably a deteriorated indicator loop meant to detect metal passing overhead, but freed itself and cleared into the main anchorage at 0037. Prien spent the next 20 minutes studying the harbor through binoculars. To his surprise, Scapa Flow appeared nearly empty. The home fleet had dispersed to sea earlier that day, leaving only Royal Oak, the seaplane carrier Pegasus, and a few auxiliaries. Prien chose Royal Oak as his primary target. He approached to 4,000 meters and at 0058 fired 3 torpedoes. One struck the bow at 0104, one lodged in its tube, one missed entirely. The single hit caused minimal damage. Crew members thought it was an internal explosion. Prien repositioned closer, reloaded, and at 0116 fired 3 more torpedoes from 2,000 meters. All 3 struck Royal Oak's starboard side, penetrating beneath the armor belt. Royal Oak capsized at 0129. U-47 escaped through Kirk Sound at 0215, threading between the same block ships. Prien arrived back in Germany on October 17 to a hero's welcome. Hitler personally awarded him the Knight's Cross. German propaganda celebrated the raid as proof of U-boat invincibility. Britain mourned its dead and confronted an uncomfortable truth. The fortress was illusion. The real defenses had rotted away years earlier, leaving only the appearance of security. This appearance had killed 835 men. The vulnerability exposed at Scapa Flow wasn't unique. Across the Atlantic and Pacific, Allied naval bases faced the same threat: submarine penetration of supposedly protected harbors. As the war expanded through 1940 and 1941, the pattern repeated with alarming frequency. In the Mediterranean, Gibraltar's harbor, Britain's critical stronghold controlling the strait between Europe and Africa, faced constant threat from Italian frogmen and German U-boats operating from French Atlantic ports. Alexandria, Egypt, where the Royal Navy's Mediterranean fleet based, was equally vulnerable to Italian submarines and special attack craft. Both harbors relied on World War I-era defenses. Boom nets stretched across entrances, but the nets were aging, inadequately maintained, and designed against previous generation submarines. The Pacific theater presented even greater challenges. Australia's major ports, Sydney, Fremantle, Darwin, Brisbane, sprawled across thousands of miles of coastline, each requiring individual defense. Forward bases in New Guinea, the Philippines, and Pacific Islands needed protection but had virtually no defensive infrastructure. The U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet, based at Pearl Harbor, relied primarily on air patrols and submarine nets across the harbor entrance, but these defenses were incomplete by December 1941. The Royal Navy's Boom Defense Department, a specialized branch responsible for harbor protection since World War I, began a crash program in late 1939 to survey, repair, and upgrade anti-submarine defenses worldwide. What they found was disturbing. Most existing boom nets were compromised by corrosion, damage, or inadequate design. Many harbors had no boom defenses at all. The handful of boom defense vessels available, mostly elderly trawlers converted for net handling, were insufficient for the global commitment required. The solution emerged through desperate necessity: design and deploy anti-submarine boom nets on an industrial scale, creating physical barriers that submarines could neither penetrate nor circumvent. The nets themselves would be brute force engineering: heavy steel mesh suspended from the surface to depths of 30 to 40 feet or more, anchored to the seabed with concrete weights, supported by massive steel buoys, and operated by purpose-built vessels capable of opening and closing gate sections. But for Scapa Flow specifically, Churchill demanded something more than nets. The decision was made by November 1939. Construct 4 massive concrete causeways, barriers that would physically close Kirk Sound, Water Sound, Scary Sound, and East Weddell Sound, the channels between mainland Orkney and the islands of Lamholm, Glimpsholm, Burray, and South Ronaldsay. The barriers would serve dual purposes: impenetrable naval defense and eventually public roadways linking the islands. The engineering challenge was immense. The 4 channels totaled 2,257 meters in combined length. Maximum water depths ranged from 38 to 59 feet. Tidal currents reached 12 knots, with tidal ranges up to 12 feet. The project would require dropping 250,000 tons of rubble into these rushing channels, contained in wire cages called gabions, then topping them with 66,000 concrete blocks weighing 5 and 10 tons each. Balfour Beatty & Co. Ltd. received the contract in May 1940. Material would be quarried from Orkney's bedrock. Concrete blocks would be cast on industrial scale. Overhead cableways would transport the blocks from casting yards to the construction sites. Labor arrived in January 1942. Over 1,300 Italian prisoners of war, captured in North Africa, housed in camps on Lam Holm and Buray. They would provide much of the labor for the next 3 years. The barriers progressed slowly through 1941, 1942, and 1943. By September 1944, all 4 causeways were complete, blocking the eastern approaches with solid barriers of rock and concrete. They were formally opened as public roads on May 12, 1945, just days after Germany's surrender. At Sydney Harbour, reconnaissance in 1940 revealed that the harbour entrance between North Head and South Head, approximately 1,500 meters wide and up to 40 meters deep, was completely undefended. Japanese submarines had already been detected off Australia's coast in December 1939, demonstrating the threat was immediate, not theoretical. The decision was made in November 1940. Construct a boom net system across Sydney Harbour entrance capable of stopping any submarine attempting penetration. Design specifications were ambitious. The net would consist of steel rings 450 millimeters or 18 inches in diameter, each ring formed from steel wire approximately 25 millimeters thick. The rings would be woven into mesh with approximately 15-centimeter gaps, large enough to allow water flow and reduce tidal stress, but far too small for a submarine to pass. Individual net sections would measure 30 meters in height and 120 meters in length, suspended from steel flotation buoys and anchored to the seabed with concrete weights. Multiple sections would be joined to span the harbor entrance, with gate sections that could be opened by boom defense vessels to allow friendly ships passage. Construction began in January 1942. The net material was woven on Garden Island using specialized equipment. Steel rings were forged and interlocked by hand, laborious work requiring experienced metalworkers. Support infrastructure was massive. 49 clusters of 4 piles each were driven into the seabed for the central boom section, each cluster forming a dolphin, a timber or steel structure anchoring net sections. Additional piles supported gate mechanisms. The work proceeded 7 days a week, driven by intelligence reports indicating Japanese submarines were approaching Australian waters. Similar installations began at other critical harbors. Fremantle, Western Australia, received anti-submarine and anti-torpedo nets across its harbor entrance in January 1941. Darwin's boom, planned since 1938, became operational by early January 1942, fortunate timing as the Japanese would bomb Darwin heavily on February 19, 1942. Brisbane, Townsville, and other Queensland ports received booms by mid-1942. Across the Pacific, forward bases at Milne Bay, Noumea, and dozens of other locations received net defenses as materials and boom defense vessels became available. The protective principle was simple. A submarine striking a properly deployed boom net at attack speed, typically 5 to 8 knots submerged, would become entangled in the steel mesh. The interlocking rings would foul the boat's hydroplanes, screws, periscopes, and conning tower. The submarine would be trapped, unable to dive deeper or surface, its position marked by disturbed net sections and indicator buoys attached to the net at intervals. Surface patrol craft would converge on the location and depth charge the helpless target. From 1940 through 1942, the boom net deployment became one of the war's largest engineering efforts, unglamorous, largely invisible, but absolutely critical to naval survival. The effectiveness of properly deployed boom nets faced its first major test on the night of May 31, 1942, when 3 Japanese Midget submarines attempted to penetrate Sydney Harbour. The attack would demonstrate both the net's capabilities and the consequences of incomplete installations. Japanese intelligence had conducted extensive reconnaissance. Float planes launched from submarines photographed Sydney's harbour defenses in January and February 1942. The photographs revealed boom net construction in progress, but also showed that gate sections remained incomplete and ships frequently entered and exited the harbor, requiring gates to open. Japanese naval planners concluded that a carefully timed attack during evening traffic when gates were likely to be open could succeed. On May 31, 1942, 5 Japanese submarines of the 8th Submarine Squadron took position off Sydney. 3 carried Midget submarines, Type A Kohio Teki 2-man vessels, 78 feet long, armed with 2 18-inch torpedoes. The plan was straightforward. Launch the Midget submarines around 5:30 p.m., infiltrate the harbor during evening ship movements, attack the American cruiser USS Chicago, known to be anchored inside, and other targets, then rendezvous with mother submarines offshore, or more likely die in the attack. At 8:01 p.m., HMAS Euroma, a Channel patrol boat, detected an object on its indicator loop, a magnetic detection system laid on the seabed. The reading indicated a metal object passing over the loop, but Euroma's commander couldn't visually confirm any surface vessel. The submarine had passed beneath at periscope depth. The alarm went unreported. Indicator loops frequently produced false readings from schools of fish, debris, or bottom currents. 29 minutes later, at 8:30 p.m., night watchman James Cargill was aboard a Maritime Services Board construction barge moored near the western boom section. He spotted what appeared to be a fishing boat caught in the net, approximately 200 meters away. Taking a rowboat to investigate, Cargill approached the object and was shocked to discover it was the bow section of a submarine, clearly not Australian or American, tangled in the boom net's steel mesh. The submarine was M14, commanded by Lieutenant Keiyu Matsuo and Petty Officer Masao Tsuzuku. M14 had approached the boom at 8:15 p.m., attempting to pass beneath the net by diving to maximum depth and using the strong tidal current to sweep under. But the Sydney boom extended deeper than Japanese intelligence had estimated, suspended to 40 feet in some sections. M14 had struck the net at depth, and the interlocking 18-inch steel rings had seized the submarine's bow, hydroplanes, and conning tower. The submarine was pinned, unable to move forward or backward, its battery draining as the electric motors strained uselessly. Cargill rowed back to the barge and telephoned harbor authorities. HMAS Yeroma received orders to investigate at 8:52 p.m. and found Cargill's report accurate. A submarine was caught in the boom. At 10 p.m., HMAS Lolita, a patrol launch armed with depth charges, arrived on scene. Commissioned Warrant Officer Herbert Anderson assessed the situation. The submarine was trapped but could still activate scuttling charges, potentially damaging the boom and killing nearby personnel. Anderson made the difficult decision to attack immediately. Lolita approached the entangled submarine and dropped 2 depth charges set for shallow detonation, hoping to force the crew to surrender. Instead, at approximately 10:27 p.m., the crew of M14 activated their self-destruct charges. The explosion destroyed the submarine completely, killing both crew members, and sent a geyser of water and debris 100 feet into the air. Fragments of the submarine rained down on nearby vessels. The boom net held, damaged but intact. But M14's entanglement was only 1/3 of the attack. 2 other Midget submarines had successfully penetrated the incomplete boom sections. M21, commanded by Lieutenant Katsuhisa Ban and Petty Officer Mamoru Ashibe, had passed through the eastern gate section around 8 p.m., slipping through while the gate was open for harbor traffic. M24, commanded by Lieutenant Kenshi Chuman and Petty Officer Takeshi Omori, had followed through the same gap at 8:30 p.m. Inside the harbor, the 2 submarines faced a target-rich environment: USS Chicago, multiple Australian warships, merchant vessels, and harbor infrastructure. M24 located Chicago at 10:25 p.m. and fired both torpedoes from approximately 500 meters. Both torpedoes missed the cruiser. One struck the seawall at Garden Island, exploding with devastating effect. The blast destroyed HMAS Günther, a converted ferry being used as depot ship for naval personnel. 19 Australian sailors and 2 British Royal Navy sailors died in the explosion. The second torpedo ran ashore without detonating and was later recovered. M21 attempted an attack in Taylor's Bay, but was sighted by the patrol vessel HMS Günther at 3 a.m. on June 1. Günther and several other vessels bracketed the submarine's last known position with depth charges. M21 was destroyed. Its wreck was located in November 2006. Both crew members died. M24 managed to escape the harbor. The submarine's fate remained unknown for 64 years until its wreck was discovered in 2006 off Sydney's northern beaches, 4 kilometers offshore in 55 meters of water. Evidence suggests the crew successfully escaped Sydney Harbor but were unable to rendezvous with their mother submarine and died when their battery was exhausted. Both crew members' remains were found inside. The attack's final accounting was sobering. 21 Allied personnel killed, 1 ferry destroyed, 1 cruiser narrowly missed. But 1 Japanese submarine had been stopped completely by the boom net, exactly as designed. The 2 submarines that penetrated had done so only because construction wasn't finished and gates were inadequate. By August 1942, Sydney's boom became fully operational with properly functioning gates, complete net sections reaching appropriate depths, and stringent procedures for gate operations. No further penetration attempts succeeded, despite ongoing Japanese submarine activity off Australia's coast through 1943. The boom remained in place until early 1946, when it was finally dismantled. The Sydney attack transformed harbor defense doctrine worldwide. Every Allied port with incomplete boom defenses received urgent orders to accelerate construction. Gate procedures were standardized and drilled constantly. Boom defense vessels received priority for crew training. The lesson was clear. A boom net worked, but only if properly constructed, maintained, and operated. Half measures created false security, arguably worse than no defenses at all. The anti-submarine boom net represented a fundamentally different defensive philosophy than radar, sonar, or depth charges. Those technologies attempted to detect and destroy threats. The boom net simply made penetration physically impossible. The design was pure Allied wartime thinking. Overwhelming force over sophistication. A submarine net had no electronics to fail, no power requirements, couldn't be jammed or deceived. Weather that grounded aircraft and reduced sonar effectiveness didn't diminish the net's capability. A storm that prevented patrol boats from leaving harbor didn't matter. The net remained in position. Maintenance was straightforward. Inspect for corrosion, replace damaged sections, ensure proper anchoring. A crew with minimal training could operate the system effectively. Engineering requirements drove the massive construction. First, the net had to physically stop a submarine traveling at attack speed. German Type 7 and Type 9 U-boats could achieve 7 to 8 knots submerged. Japanese I-class submarines could reach 8 knots underwater. American fleet submarines could sustain 9 knots submerged. The boom net had to absorb the kinetic energy of 1,000 to 2,000 tons of submarine striking steel mesh at this speed without catastrophic failure. This requirement dictated the massive steel construction. The 450-millimeter diameter rings used at Sydney Harbor were forged from steel wire approximately 25 millimeters thick, about as thick as a human thumb. Each individual ring could withstand tremendous tensile stress. The interlocking design distributed impact forces across the entire net section, preventing a single-point failure from parting the barrier. When a submarine struck the net, hundreds or thousands of rings would share the load, flexing but not breaking, entangling the target progressively as it pushed deeper into the mesh. Second, nets extended deep enough to prevent submarines from diving beneath. Most harbor entrances had depths of 30 to 60 feet at low tide. Submarines attempting penetration would naturally try to pass under the net at maximum safe depth. The solution? Suspend the net from the surface to depths greater than any submarine's operating depth in harbor waters. At Sydney, net sections extended to 40 feet. At Fremantle, where the harbor entrance reached 60 feet, nets were deployed to 50 feet. Some installations used weighted bottom sections to ensure nets reached the seabed itself. Third, the net required support infrastructure capable of holding position in tidal currents, storms, and rough seas. A boom net spanning 1,000 to 1,500 meters, weighing hundreds of tons, exerted enormous forces on its moorings. At Sydney Harbor, where tidal ranges reached 2 meters and currents could exceed 3 knots, the engineering challenge was substantial. The solution employed massive timber dolphins, clusters of 4 piles each, driven deep into the seabed, forming rigid anchor points. Steel cables connected net sections to dolphins, distributing stress across multiple attachment points. Fourth, gate sections had to open reliably despite the system's enormous weight and complexity. A single gate section might consist of 3 or 4 30-meter-tall, 120-meter-long net panels weighing 40 tons total, suspended between dolphins and anchored to prevent drift. Bar-class boom defense vessels exemplified purpose-built design. These ships displaced 533 tons, measured 41 meters in length, and were powered by reciprocating steam engines producing 850 horsepower for 12 knots maximum speed. They were armed with anti-aircraft guns, typically one 12-pounder gun and several 20-millimeter Ehrlichen cannons for self-defense. But their primary equipment was heavy winches and cable handling gear. A bar-class vessel would approach a gate section, attach towing cables to designated dolphins or neck bridles, engage its winches, and physically drag the gate section aside, a process taking 15 to 30 minutes depending on conditions. Once friendly vessels passed through, the gate had to be closed immediately, all while managing fierce tidal currents, rough seas, and the constant awareness that an enemy submarine might be stalking nearby. Trade-offs were accepted. Steel mesh was heavy, expensive to transport, and labor-intensive to install. A major harbor might require thousands of tons of net material plus supporting infrastructure: buoys, anchors, winches, dolphins, gate vessels, maintenance crews. Sydney employed 49 4-pile clusters. Darwin's boom was even larger. Cockburn Sound's boom spanned 9.37 kilometers, the longest such structure constructed during the war. But these costs were acceptable because losing even a single capital ship in harbor was unacceptable. HMS Royal Oak represented 29,150 tons of steel, 9 15-inch guns, decades of institutional knowledge among her crew, and years of construction time. In purely economic terms, protecting dozens of harbors with steel nets cost less than replacing one sunk battleship. The morale impact was incalculable. A fleet that couldn't rest safely couldn't fight effectively. Crews needed sleep. Ships needed maintenance. Commanders needed time for planning, training, and logistics. The boom net worked 24 hours a day without requiring alert crews, radar, or patrol boats in position. When crew members slept, when equipment underwent maintenance, when human error or distraction created gaps in vigilance, the net continued its silent watch. Perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated that low-tech solutions could be remarkably effective in high-tech warfare. While scientists developed radar and sonar, engineers deployed steel mesh and concrete anchors, technology comprehensible to medieval castle builders. The sophistication lay not in the barrier itself, but in the scale, precision, and operational procedures that made it work across hundreds of harbors worldwide. The global deployment of boom net defenses from 1940 to 1945 created a strategic transformation that U-boat commanders learned to dread. Harbors that had once represented opportunity, concentrations of high-value targets, predictable locations, navigable approaches, became death traps. At Gibraltar, the Royal Navy installed comprehensive boom defenses across the harbor entrance by mid-1940. U-boats operating from French Atlantic ports regularly patrolled the strait, hoping to catch British warships entering or leaving. None succeeded in penetrating the harbor defenses from 1940 to 1944. The Mediterranean fleet at Alexandria faced even greater threats. Italian submarines based at Taranto and La Spezia had short transit times. Italian frogmen, the Decima Flottiglia MAS, had demonstrated remarkable capability. On December 18, 1941, Italian frogmen penetrated Alexandria harbor riding human torpedoes, severely damaging battleships HMS Valiant and Queen Elizabeth. The attack succeeded because they approached through gaps in incomplete boom defenses. After this disaster, the Royal Navy completed Alexandria's system and implemented stringent underwater patrols. No further successful penetrations occurred. The strategic impact extended beyond preventing losses. U-boats forced into longer routes faced increased exposure to Allied countermeasures. German submarines attempting to attack shipping in the English Channel couldn't transit through the Strait of Dover due to comprehensive mine barriers and boom nets. Instead, they had to circumnavigate Scotland, adding 5 to 7 days to each patrol, consuming fuel and supplies, increasing crew fatigue, and extending exposure to Allied air patrols and escort groups. This operational inefficiency reduced the number of U-boats available in critical patrol zones at any given time, directly impacting Germany's commerce raiding strategy. The Pacific theater demonstrated similar patterns. After the Sydney Harbor attack on May 31, 1942, Japanese submarines attempted no further harbor penetrations along Australia's east coast. The completed boom nets at Sydney, Brisbane, Townsville, and other ports represented barriers too formidable to risk valuable submarines against. Japanese naval strategy shifted to open ocean interdiction, attacking convoys and warships at sea rather than in harbor, a far less efficient approach. At Pearl Harbor, boom net installations accelerated dramatically after December 7, 1941. By March 1942, Pearl Harbor had comprehensive boom defenses across all major entrances, with dedicated boom defense vessels operating gate sections around the clock. The U.S. Pacific Fleet could conduct repairs, rearmament, and training operations with confidence that the base itself was secure. Forward bases presented unique challenges as Allied forces advanced across the Pacific, taking Guadalcanal, the Gilbert Islands, the Marshalls, the Marianas. Each newly captured harbor required immediate defensive installation. The U.S. Navy's auxiliary net layers, purpose-built vessels carrying boom net materials, deployed to forward areas within days of island capture. At Ulithi Atoll in the Caroline Islands, captured in September 1944, the U.S. Navy constructed one of the Pacific's largest fleet anchorages. Boom nets protected the atoll's entrances even before permanent base facilities were completed. The anchorage could accommodate up to 700 ships, carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, auxiliaries, transports, all protected by boom defenses that Japanese submarines never successfully penetrated. Boom defense vessel crews faced dangerous work. Operating gate sections in rough seas required seamanship and constant vigilance. The procedure was hazardous. Approach the gate section, attach cables, engage winches, all while maintaining position against tidal currents. Crew members worked exposed on deck, handling heavy cables, watching for submarines. Many sailors were injured by cable failures or winch accidents. Boom defense crews were high-value targets. Submarines that couldn't penetrate might attack gate ships instead. HMS Barlight was torpedoed by U-374 off Gibraltar on July 28, 1943. HMS Barnhurst was sunk by U-371 off Algiers on September 8, 1943, with heavy loss of life. Yet the work continued throughout the war. Every convoy entering harbor, every capital ship returning from operations, every damaged vessel limping back for repairs, all required boom gates to open. The cumulative effect was thousands of gate operations, performed safely, enabling the fleet operations that eventually won the war. Major boom net installations, 1940 to 1945. Sydney Harbor. 1,480 meters main boom, 450 millimeter diameter steel rings, 49 pile clusters, operational August 1942. Cockburn Sound, Western Australia, 9.37 kilometers, northern approaches only, longest boom structure of the war. Darwin, comprehensive boom system operational January 1942, protected harbor during Japanese air raids. Scapa Flow, multiple sections, each approximately 274 meters long, weighing 40-plus tons, supplemented Churchill barriers. Gibraltar, multi-layer boom defenses across harbor entrance, operational mid-1940. Alexandria, complete boom system including anti-torpedo nets, operational 1942. Pearl Harbor, major installations across all entrances, operational March 1942. Fremantle, Halifax, San Francisco Bay, comprehensive boom defenses protecting submarine bases and fleet anchorages. Ulithi Atoll, protected anchorage capacity for 700-plus ships, largest Pacific forward base. Numerous forward Pacific bases, Milne Bay, Noumea, Espiritu Santo, Manus, and Nitawek, others. Boom defense vessels produced. U.S. Navy 77 auxiliary net layers, 32 Aloe-class, 40 Islanthus-class wooden vessels, and 15 Cohoes-class, 1940 to 1945. U.S. Navy 43-plus net gate craft, YNG designation, specialized gate operation vessels. Royal Navy extensive bar-class boom defense vessels, 533 tons displacement, 41 meters length, 12 knots. Royal Navy additional net class and converted trawlers for boom operations. Royal Australian Navy multiple boom defense vessels for Pacific theater operations. Churchill barriers, Scapa Flow permanent closure. 4 causeways closing Kirk Sound, Water Sound, Scary Sound, and East Weddell Sound. Total length 2,257 meters combined. Construction period May 1940 to September 1944. Materials 250,000 tons of rock rubble in wire gabions, 66,000 concrete blocks of 5-ton and 10-ton. Labor force 1,300-plus Italian prisoners of war and British civilian workers. Formally opened as public roads May 12, 1945. Operational record: 0 confirmed U-boat penetrations through properly maintained boom defenses at Gibraltar, Alexandria, 1939 to 1944. 0 successful submarine attacks inside Pearl Harbor after March 1942 boom completion. Sydney Midget submarine attack May 31, 1942. 1 submarine, M14, stopped completely by boom net as designed. 2 penetrated incomplete sections. No Japanese submarine penetrations of Australian harbors after boom installations completed, 1942 to 1945. Forced U-boat route changes added 5 to 7 days per patrol. Scotland route versus Channel, reducing operational efficiency. HMS Royal Oak casualties, pre-boom era, 835 killed October 14, 1939. Sydney attack casualties, incomplete boom, 21 Allied personnel killed. Post-war service. Most boom nets dismantled 1945-1946, materials salvaged. Churchill barriers, permanent roads still in daily use, carrying A961 highway across Orkney Islands. Boom defense vessels, majority scrapped or converted to other duties by 1950. Doctrine: physical harbor barriers remain fundamental to naval base security today. The Churchill barriers still stand, carrying the A961 road across channels where U-47 once slipped through in darkness. Over 8 decades, the causeways have become more than wartime defenses. They're vital infrastructure for South Ronaldsay, Burray, Glimsholm, and Lambholm, connecting communities that were isolated before 1945. Tourism flows across these barriers to visit the Italian chapel on Lambholm, the beautiful structure built by prisoners of war, a symbol of reconciliation emerging from wartime necessity. The boom nets themselves are gone, dismantled after 1945 as naval warfare evolved. Sydney's boom was removed by early 1946. Most other installations followed within months. The bar-class boom defense vessels were decommissioned, sold for scrap, or converted to other duties. Only fragments survive. Timber pilings visible at low tide in Sydney Harbor, concrete anchor blocks on harbor floors identified by divers, the occasional gate winch housing preserved in naval museums. But the principle the boom nets embodied remains fundamental to naval security today. Modern harbor defenses still employ physical barriers, floating booms, anti-swimmer nets, controlled access channels. They're supplemented by sophisticated electronics, underwater sensors, and patrol craft, but the basic concept hasn't changed. When protecting high-value naval assets, you build barriers that physically prevent access. The contrast with HMS Royal Oak's fate defines the transformation. In October 1939, Scapa Flow's defenses were deteriorated block ships, corroded nets, and institutional complacency. By 1944, impenetrable concrete barriers and properly maintained steel nets operated by dedicated crews protected the anchorage. The home fleet could anchor safely, conduct repairs, and plan operations without fear. In an era of technological sophistication, the boom net validated an uncomfortable truth. A wall of steel mesh, suspended from surface to seabed, simply could not be circumvented. Electronic detection could be jammed, patrol boats evaded, sonar deceived, but interlocking steel rings physically blocked passage. No courage or skill could overcome geometry. 835 sailors died aboard HMS Royal Oak before this lesson was learned. 21 more died at Sydney when defenses were incomplete. Boom defense crews died in accidents and attacks throughout the war. But their sacrifice created systems that saved countless others. Every carrier returning to Ulithi, every damaged cruiser reaching Sydney, every convoy unloading in protected harbors. When naval architects design base defenses today, physical barriers remain first-line protection. Modern materials have replaced steel mesh, but the concept is identical. Some principles are fundamental, rooted in physics, not technology. No matter how advanced submarines become, they cannot occupy the same space as a barrier. That truth, purchased with steel and sacrifice, protected Allied naval power when victory was uncertain. The Churchill barriers and boom nets, one permanent, one vanished, proved that overwhelming commitment to simple principles can succeed where sophistication fails. U-boat captains understood this from periscope depth. They had courage, skill, and desperation, but they couldn't pass steel curtains that would not yield.